Hi everyone, Mrs. McGrath here. We're going to talk today about fractions greater than one whole. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see what I'm looking at in front of me here. So here I have examples of fractions that are less than one. 1/2, 2/3, 3/4. Then down here, I have two different ways that we can talk about fractions that are more than one whole. One way we could talk about them is by calling them fractions greater than one. So here's my model. I have more than one whole colored, so I have one whole and another piece. I could say this is 1 1/2, like down below here, but I can also call it 3/2 because I have three pieces shaded, and each of these pieces is called 1/2. Same thing here. I have one whole shaded and another piece, so 1/4. I have 1 1/4 shaded, which you can see down here. But I can also call it 5/4 because I have 5 pieces total that are shaded, and it takes 4 of them to make the whole. So these numbers where you see, or these fractions where you see the numerator is bigger than the denominator, we call those fractions greater than 1. Okay, as soon as we see that number on the top is larger, it means we have more than one whole, and it means that we can also write it a different way, like down below here. So these two models are exactly the same, but our numbers look a little bit different. So we're going to be exploring that a little bit more. On your Zern lesson 9, you had some problems that looked like this, where you had to give fractions or name fractions that looked like this, where the numerator was larger than the denominator. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and show you some other posters here. So fractions less than 1, these are fractions that we kind of started off with. You know, we were partitioning shapes into equal size pieces. You may have had to shade or locate 1/3 of a shape or 1/2 of a shape. All of these are less than one whole, and I know that because the numerator is smaller than the denominator on all of these. So 1 is smaller than 3, 4 is smaller than 9, 9 is less than 10. So I know that each of those is a fraction that is less than one whole. When I get to these two numbers being the same, like if this was a 3/3, then that would be one whole. And anything that is bigger than that, so if this was a 4, so 4/3, that would mean it was bigger than one whole. So when we're talking about fractions less than 1, I can tell it's less than 1 by looking at my numerator and seeing that it's smaller than the denominator. We call fractions that are greater than 1, we used to call them improper because the top number was bigger than the bottom number. So parents, if you're watching this with your children right now, we used to call this, when I was in school and when you were in school, we would call them improper fractions. We typically don't say that word improper anymore. We just call them fractions greater than 1. So that may come up. You'll hear that language throughout a little bit. I'll refer to fractions that have a numerator that's bigger than the denominator. We'll call them fractions greater than 1. So here I have a model. Each of these models is one whole. So here I'm looking at 2 wholes, and they're split into 3 pieces each. So I know they're called thirds. And here I have 1, 2, 3/3 shaded, and then one more. So total I have 4 pieces shaded, 4, and each piece is called a third. That's where the 3 comes from. Or it takes 3 pieces to make one of the wholes. Over here, it's the same thing. I have 2 models. Each of these represents one whole, but they're split into 4 pieces each, which is why my denominator is a 4. They're split into fourths. Here I have 4/4 shaded, 5/4, and 6/4. 6/4. Now we can also talk about numbers that are, or fractions that are greater than one whole by calling them mixed numbers. So here we're looking at the same models as my previous poster, except the numbers look a little bit different. Again, I have 2 wholes split into thirds here. So I have 3/3 and one more is 4/3. But I can also say that I have one whole shaded and I have 1/3 left that's shaded. Over here I have 1 whole shaded, and I have 2 out of the 4 that are shaded here. So when we're talking about fractions and using terminology, you'll hear the words fractions less than 1, fractions greater than 1, or mixed numbers. And I'm going to show you a model here using some pattern blocks that might help you kind of think of the different ways that we can talk about these numbers. So here I have a hexagon. The yellow hexagon is going to be our 1 whole. I'm going to build with these pieces here. So it takes 2 of them to make the same shape. So I know that each of these is going to be called 1/2 because there's 2 pieces, and this is 1 of the 2, and this is 1 of the 2. So 1/2. Do I have a Sharpie here? I'm actually going to write right on those pieces. 1/2 and 1/2. Okay, now I can continue with this. I'm going to build another one. 1/2 and 1/2. So here I have 2 wholes, or I could also say that I have 4 halves. I could continue, and if I add another one, now I have 2 wholes, 1, 2, and 1 more half. So I could call this model 2 wholes and 1/2. I have 1 whole, 2 whole, and 1/2. 2 wholes and 1/2. Or if I think about it more like a line, oops, can't flip them that way. How many halves do I have here? Well, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 5 halves. So I kind of think of using these pattern blocks to help me figure out the 2 different ways that I can write my fractions. So I can write them as if I was counting each piece individually, or I can think about what they might look like if they were together as wholes. You can do the same thing with a different type of pattern block. So again, if this is 1 whole, I'm going to use different shapes now to make that 1 whole. So each of these rhombuses is going to, 3 of them are going to make that hexagon shape. So if there's 3 of them, each one is going to be called 1/3. So I have 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3, or 3/3 altogether. If I go and build, let's see, okay, so now I still have that 1 whole, but I've added 2 more pieces. So I see I have 1/3, and then I have 2/3 over here. So I could write that as, oops, 1 whole and 2/3. So I'm looking at that whole and trying to build another, and I don't have quite enough. Or I can kind of think of them as individual objects. Each one is called a third. And how many do I have? Well, again, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5/3. So these are the 2 ways that you can write your fractions, or fractions greater than 1. We call this mixed numbers. And these are called fractions greater than 1. This is the one that we used to call improper back when I was in school. We typically don't call that anymore, call them improper anymore, but sometimes you'll have a teacher who does say that, so it's good to know that you may hear people call them improper, but typically we'll just call it a fraction greater than 1. Okay, so I hope this clarifies some of the language a little bit for you moving forward. When they're talking about fractions greater than 1, it's okay to have a fraction that has a numerator that's a little bit bigger than the bottom number. It looks kind of funny, I think, because we're not used to seeing it that way in everyday life. When we look at fractions and baking and that type of thing, we don't often see them like that, but it is possible.